Alright, this is a deep dive into some of the history of the Connie. We're gonna go back into the lounge. They've made the Connie into a lounge at the TWA hotel. And go back to my seat here. You can imagine Bob Buck flying one of these airplanes over the Atlantic, taking sextant readings out that little window in the ceiling at the navigator station. So I'm gonna do a deep dive review for probably my favorite airline book, North Star Over My Shoulder by Bob Buck. Just a little overview, and I'm gonna probably read some passages for you. Bob Buck started flying in the 30s, flying biplanes. Civilian guy. Set some records. Very accomplished young aviator. Then he got hired on with TWA. That's him. He took his typewriter on with him. It's like cumbersome, I'd take my fiddle with me. He took a typewriter because he wanted to be a writer as well as a pilot. And this is him on his retirement flight. So he started on the DC-3s, ended up flying 747s. So the whole book is about his career, and probably very unique in aviation. You know, someone who starts out flying 747s, starts out flying DC-3s and ends up flying 747s. So he saw an enormous change and growth in the airline industry during his career, and it's a fascinating book. Let's talk about some Connie things first. Let's see here. It's one of my favorite stories in the book, and it's actually pretty appropriate that we're sitting here in the Connie looking out at the wing and the engines. This is a story about the engines, about how engines develop icing when they fly through clouds and fly through weather. And it says that the Connies later, they got so-called non-icing carburetors, but really they weren't. And then they started to have fuel injection, which means it didn't have a carburetor where the fuel and air was mixed before the cylinders. It was just actually injected in the cylinders, but he says the engine still needs air, and the air comes from outside, bringing along snow, rain, freezing rain, or whatever else is out there. The carburetor may not ice, but the induction system will, and all the passageway that the air flows inbound into the engine. So, he says that a new model Constellation came with ejection, and consequently was announced as non-icing, trying to sell airplanes. But they still had trouble because the induction system would now collect snow, and it made the engines run erratically. So what was needed was a way of shutting off the air coming in from outside and taking it from around under the cowling where there was warm air and snow-free air. But the problem was that the airplanes didn't have this option known as alternate air. And the pilots, the TWA pilots at the time, urged the company to modify the airplanes, but they didn't want to. It cost money. Bean counters. So nothing's changed, right? And it says, every time we encountered snow as we flew across the ocean, the engines acted up. The flight engineer played with different power settings, which leaned or enriched the mixtures. We flew on with the engines surging, running irregular, but still running. But it was disturbing to feel the rough running engines on instruments with the cold, stormy North Atlantic 17,000 feet below. No one ever had a complete engine failure because of this, but there were no guarantees, and each time it happened, you squirmed, hoping that yours wasn't the first one. The solution was simple, Buck says, and it came about on a flight that I happened to be flying, New York to Shannon, Iceland, and then Paris. One passenger was John Collins, our VP of Operation, a thin-lipped, old-time pilot who demanded perfection. International operations had recently been combined with domestic, which had been his bailiwick, so now he was the boss of it all. Ocean flying was relatively new to him, and I think he may have had that uptight feeling that people are apt to suffer when first headed out to sea. We were about 100 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia, flying through some light snow, when I drifted back to the cabin for my smile and nod session with the passengers and to look on John. I knew the snow would become heavier as we approached a low pressure area, and he was eating his dinner. He asked me, "How's it going?" I kneeled down in the aisle and responded, "It's going fine, right on flight plan, but a little snow outside. We're 100 miles off the Nova Scotia coast." And just then, the engines decided that they weren't happy with the snow and started to run rough. "What's that?" John nervously asked. "Oh, it's just snow making the engines act up. Can't help it." I didn't feel comfortable and I wanted to go back into the cockpit, but I decided to grind it into John a bit. We chatted some more as the engine's normal rhythm was disturbed by roughness. "Do you think you ought to be up front right now?" John asked. "Wouldn't do any good. I've got a good flight engineer and he's doing his best. Without that alternate air, we can't do a heck of a lot to help." He was well aware of our demands for this modification. The engines continued their slight surging. Collins looked nervous. "Bob, I want you back up front." It was an order. "Okay, see you later," and I sauntered back into the cockpit, glad to be there. We finally flew out of the snow and the engines settled down to their smooth pounding. But not long after that trip, the order went out for alternate air to be installed on the fleet. So it took someone experiencing the problem themselves in the real world to want to spend money on it. Here's another Connie blurb. "Our airplanes hadn't advanced enough to go nonstop from New York yet, because the Super Connies did. So every flight went from LaGuardia Airport to New York to Gander to Newfoundland and then to Shannon, Ireland, where we always stopped for breakfast." Imagine that, stopping for breakfast on a flight. All the passengers and crew would go into the airport restaurant for the standard breakfast of porridge, steak and eggs, Irish bread, and a wonderful strawberry jam. It was a happy hour with the few passengers, 30 was a big load, and crew all jovial in a good mood with the ocean behind and now only a couple hours left to Paris. And how different that is from what we do today, where we just blast right over all that stuff and just go non-stop. Couldn't imagine. Let's see, what else do we have here? Yeah, this is a little technical, but I think it's really cool. So the Connie had one of the last generations of piston engines, super technical, and it had turbo and superchargers, and it had compounding engines. And let's see what Bob Buck says about the compounding engines. The G was quieter and had other improvements such as better pressurization and interior climate control, but it had one terrible problem: the engines. They were called turbo compound, and we called them turbo complex because they had a weird arrangement of turbines, shafts, and gears that defied reliability. Bob Buck talks about how when the jets came along, they were much more reliable than the really complex last generation piston engines. These last piston engines, they had 3 turbines, each driven by the collected exhaust of 6 cylinders. The engine had a total of 18 cylinders, but 6 cylinders developed exhaust for the turbines, which were basically mini jet engines. The turbines spun a long shaft that went down to the engine's crankshaft and helped the propeller turn, adding power. On top of that, there was a 2-stage engine-driven supercharger. So I'm gonna geek out because I love stuff like this. This is what a turbo compound engine looks like. So you can imagine there's 2 rows of cylinders, first row, second row. The airplane is flying this way, and the propeller is attached here to the shaft. So imagine flying through the air like this. Here on the back, see if I can get my bearings here, is an exaggerated view of what the turbine looks like. So you got exhaust coming out of the cylinders, really fast gases coming out of the exploding cylinders, and it's going to this device here, which is spinning really fast, and then it's geared and adding power back into the crankshaft. So this next page kind of details what that looks like. So this is the piston moving up and down. Again, the engine's running this way through the air. Piston's moving up and down. When the explosion happens and all the gases come out, some of the gases run through a turbine, which is just how a jet engine works, is gases going through a turbine. And then it gets to spinning really fast, and then it drives these gears, and the gears actually eventually add horsepower back to the shaft where the propeller is attached to. So it's super genius and really, really complex, but I had no idea that actually was a thing until about a year ago. I just think that's a really cool piston era technology tidbit. So he says in December 1959 he flew his last Connie flight. So this Connie was with TWA at 1958. So I bet you Bob Buck flew this one. So in 1959 he flew his last Connie flight, Frankfurt to London, back to JFK, but he calls it Idlewild. 16 hours and 53 minutes. And a few days later he started 707, which is jet training, at the simulator in Kansas City. And he has a couple of words about his life flying the props versus flying the jets, which I thought was pretty interesting. He says the total flying time, New York, London, Frankfurt, now on the jet on the 707 was 8 hours and 26 minutes. His last Connie trip for the same route was 14 hours and 6 minutes. He says, it was still an all-night affair and I was still sleepy doing the overnight flight, but he felt less dragged out. As the years passed, I realized that jet speed wasn't a particular advantage to my lifestyle. Actually, the lifestyle deteriorated because with less flying time per trip, we had to fly more trips each month to get the 85 or so flight hours we normally flew in a month. The result was more commuting to the airport, more time away from home, and more nights sleeping. More nights sleep missed, so they had more overnights. So the net gain, I guess for the airline, was actually a loss for the quality of lifestyle for the pilots. It's pretty interesting. And I just have a pet peeve of mine that Bob Buck illustrates perfectly. So I also used to work for the Federal Aviation Administration on the Next Gen as a contractor. And the Federal Aviation Administration, they're doing great. I love the controllers. The technology works really well. But one of the things that I think a lot of engineers, especially computer engineers who design computer code and computer software and hardware for the air traffic controllers, for what we call air traffic management, which is basically how many planes can we get into or out of an airport, but I think the restricting factor is into an airport per hour. They're always trying to increase that by like shrinking the distance between planes. The fact is, like, you can only have one airplane on the runway at a time, so land, and it's about minimum distance is about 2.5 miles at the threshold. Because you touch, you're 2.5 miles back, the plane in front of you is touching down. They need time to land, get all the way down, brake, slow down enough to get off the runway. And by the time they're getting off the runway, which just happened tonight, we were 2.5 miles behind the airplane, just clearing the runway. We were just at about 200 feet. boom, touching down, and there's, guess what, there's a line of like 5-6 planes behind us, all 2.5 miles behind us, getting into the runway. There's no amount of technology, computer or otherwise, that can fix that basic fact. You can only land a certain number of airplanes on a runway at one time. It's interesting. Bob Buck says that, and he's got a really good story here. And I actually have an illustration to show you too that I drew back, in the mid-2000s when I read this book. But let me read his story first. So he's talking about, this is even back in the 1930s. So talking about air traffic delays and stuff getting really backed up in the 1930s around the New York area. And he says, the only limitation now is how many planes can be squeezed onto a runway per hour. 40 being about the limit. I don't know if that's true now, but that's what he says. So if 41 show up, then stacking and holding, delay vectors, slowing down. Even today, that's what happens. The runway is the limiting factor. Some airports use more runways. But the runway is still the controlling factor, because when more airplanes show up than the runways can take, then delays begin. So adding more controllers, radar, or whatever doesn't reduce delays beyond a certain point. In the final analysis, it's the pavement of the runway that counts. And here's the story. Way back in the early days of air traffic control, someone suggested getting a railroad traffic expert to look over the situation and make suggestions. The railroad guy studied it and then almost laughed himself silly as he explained that the aviation industry did it ass backwards, with many tracks en route, but only one, the runway, at the terminal. The railroads, he pointed out, have few tracks en route, but spread out and fan out in the terminals. He shook his head and declared the situation was hopeless, and he may have been right. And here's the illustration I drew for myself back in the mid-2000s. So here's the aviation situation where you have all these planes coming in from everywhere. You can fly anywhere you want, really, but you have to all cramp down and funnel into one runway. But what the railroads do is they have maybe 1 or 2 tracks between cities, but when they get to their terminal, they fan out. And they put, and you can see this from the air too, they have many different places where they can park or land the trains. So it's exactly the opposite situation. Here you have many planes coming in trying to funnel all into one runway, and here you have a bunch of trains, few tracks, but when they get to where they're going, they all fan out and they can all park wherever they want to. I thought that was really cool. It's still applicable to today. So here's the last thing I'll say with North Star over my shoulder, Bob Buck. He gives a shout out to the pilots. But my heroes are the unknown, unheralded airline pilots who fly without incident or accident, making decisions, stopping potential disasters before they happen, flying all night to see the dawn through scratchy, tired eyes, fighting bad weather in all seasons, from ice to thunderstorms, away from home and family, at least half of every month. You see him and now her walking through the airline terminals, wheeling their black brain bags and overnight cases, unnoticed except for the uniform. So that's North Star over my shoulder, Bob Buck from the TWA Hotel, Connie.